Our last speaker is David Papineau. He's a professor of philosophy of science at King's College London and the City University of New York Graduate Center. And the title of his talk is Self-Knowledge of Sensory States.
Thank you, Tufan, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation. Thanks to the department. I'm delighted to be at this wonderful conference. How's that going? Is that okay? It sounds fine? And I've been learning a lot. I should say that when I was invited, I thought for a bit, well, I've got to come not really working on imagination, but then I thought I've got this big project on sensory experience, and come to think of it, quite a lot of the things I said about sensory experience tie to sensory imagery, and so I will talk about that and draw the connections with sensory imagery. And as a bonus, there's quite a lot of overlap with Tufan's talk. He was talking about knowledge of experience, and I'm talking about that as well, and at the end I'll be talking about phenomenal concepts. So here's the plan of what I'm going to talk about. I'm first of all going to give you some of the background to this project. I'm just finishing a book now on the nature of experience, sensory experience, and then I'll say a bit about transparency, something that philosophers talk about a lot in connection with sensory experience. Then I'll talk about sensory introspection. How do we know what experiences we're having, and connectedly, how do we know what sensory images we're having? That'll lead me to draw a distinction between two ways of thinking about mental states, and then finally I'll say something about phenomenal concepts. So background. Just to be clear at the beginning, I'm a philosopher. I think of states as paradigmatically instantiations of properties by particulars. So I think of mental states as instantiations of mental properties by subjects, people, perhaps other intelligent subjects. And so I think about sensory states, conscious sensory states. So all my sensory states I'm talking about will be conscious. I don't deny that there's things worth calling unconscious sensory states, but I'm interested in conscious sensory states. And I think of them as instantiations of conscious sensory properties by people. So far, nothing. Right, that's just kind of philosophers being fussy, just to get clear about ontology. What is particular is the way I think about the conscious sensory properties. And I think of them as intrinsic, non-relational, internal properties of people, to do with the way that we feel, and that have no essential connection with anything outside the head. So I call that the qualitative view. So sensory properties are internal, qualitative properties. So you might think, well, no, what's so peculiar, what's so particular about that? And so I'll say a little bit about that. I want to say something about that to the philosophers, and there's something about that to the non-philosophers, because different things will need saying to both of them. So philosophers will say, look, there's lots of philosophers who believe in qualia, i.e. elements of sensory experience that are just like what I said, internal, non-relational, intrinsic, nothing to do with anything outside the head. And indeed lots of philosophers do talk about that. Ned Block is a great proponent of qualia, Christopher Peacock. Philosophers talk about qualia tend to focus on certain particular aspects of sensory experience. They might talk about, I don't know, the blurriness of vision when you take your glasses off, or the apparent size of an object that you notice, kind of perception you know is the same size, but when it's further away it's kind of a smaller part of the visual field. So they'll say there's certain aspects, maybe attentional contrast, maybe the way colours feel to you. They'll say there's certain aspects of sensory experience which are kind of internal to how it feels, and nothing much to do with how the world outside is being represented. Now philosophers tend to think that so experience has two elements, the internal feely bit, And then alongside that, a lot of conscious parts of experience that are somehow world involved. That's not my view. My view, Ned Block has invented the term paint, mental paint, for the internal feeling bits as opposed to elements of experience that are world involving. My view is it's all paint. Right? So all aspects of experience are just internal feelings with no essential connection with the world beyond. Okay, I can see the scientists, they're getting a bit lazy because they think, hang on, haven't we all known that since Galileo and Descartes? And my view, yes, they're right. I mean, indeed, this is part of informed philosophical scientific common sense since 1600 or so. But to the scientists, I'll say what I think is what scarcely any other philosophers think. Philosophers all think that sensory experience is somehow relational, takes us out beyond the mind to the world itself. And I want to come back to this slide. Philosophers, I'm going to talk about naive realists and representationalists both. What time did I start? You're counting. What time did I start? How long have I had so far? No, I'm doing fine. I
4 minutes.
I want to keep doing fine. I want to make sure I don't ramble too much at the beginning. Philosophers are very moved by a line of thought that they refer to as the transparency of experience. Here's a famous quote from Gilbert Harman. He says, suppose you try and turn your mind inwards, you try and focus on these supposed qualitative aspects of your experience. So you're looking at a tree, and you now try and think about the feeling properties of you. He says all that's going to happen is you're going to look harder at the tree and notice the features of the tree. It's a certain shape, certain colour, certain texture, and so on. So the thought is that our experience is made of worldly properties, the kind of properties that physical objects can have. The shapes and colours and shapes and colours are the most obvious ones, but perhaps the texture of the tree, perhaps when you feel it, you feel the texture. Worldly properties are part of your experience. This view comes in two modes. They're direct realists. Quite a lot of philosophers in my country, in Britain, are direct realists. And they think the experience is constituted, the conscious feel, by your being in contact with the world out there. Suppose you see a yellow ball, there's a real yellow ball in front of you. So there's a fact that there's this thing, it's round and it's yellow. And they think your experience is constituted by the fact that you are in perceptual contact with that fact. So the actual ball and its colour and shape constitute your experience. That's naive realism. Representationalists say, no, that theory doesn't really work, because surely you can have the same conscious feelings, same conscious state, same conscious experience, even if you're having an illusion or hallucination. Ball's not yellow, or maybe there's no ball there at all. Surely the same conscious property. Direct realists have a response. I won't go into that. Well, their view is you don't have the same conscious property in the bad cases. You might think you do, but you don't. There's the real conscious property when there's a real yellow ball there, and then there's some kind of poor relation that occurs in the cases of hallucination and illusion. The representations say, no, surely you can have the same conscious property even if there's no yellow ball there. And they say what's going on is the properties of yellowness and roundness are in your experience as representing the world, not necessarily as instantiated in the world in front of you, but your experience incorporates the properties and thereby represents the world as including something yellow and round. Now believe me, all philosophers who work on the metaphysics of sensory experience, the nature of the properties I'm talking about, are pretty much either direct realists, naive realists, or representationalists. And I can see the scientists looking at me as if I must be mad, but I'm afraid that's how it is, because both those views are, if you ask me, pretty obviously hopeless. So I already explained the objection to naive realism. It has to deny that you can be in the same conscious state when you're hallucinating or suffering a delusion. And so they'll say there's the real good conscious state, and there's a correlation, but as it happens, you can't tell the difference from the inside because you might be having a very convincing hallucination. And so they're committed to the idea of conscious differences which aren't available to introspection. Seems to me to undermine the whole idea of the conscious state. I lose my hold on what a conscious state is supposed to be if there can be conscious differences that the subject themselves can never be aware of. The problem with representationalism is a bit more subtle, but think about what's supposed to be going on in the case where you have a hallucination, say. The idea is that somehow the properties of yellowness and roundness are in your experience and making it the experience that it is. I said, how can that be when I'm having an illusion? Say, there's no roundness in front of me. So there's nothing round in front of me, and I'm not round, my brain's not round, my mental state isn't round, nothing is round, yet somehow the property of roundness is supposed to somehow be present in my mind and make my consciousness the way it is. I think that makes no good sense at all. You might think, look, there's this kind of sensory roundness in your head, and that's if what you mean by that is the kind of conscious property I have, sure, that's in my head. But that's not the same kind of property as objects out there, real worldly objects. So that's why I think the only coherent view is a positive one. The one that we learned with Galileo and Descartes, that the conscious properties are one thing inside our head and the world outside is something different. I think everything I've said so far would go just the same for sensory imagery. I want to say what I just said, the properties we have in sensory imagery are internal, intrinsic, qualitative, no essential connection with the world beyond. Representationalists, I know saying no, in sensory imagery, if we image something round and yellow, the properties of roundness and yellowness are somehow present in our experience, even though uninstantiated, making the experience they are. That makes no sense. Direct realists, I'm not quite so sure what they say about imagery. I started looking it up a bit. I know there is one, Ricardo Manzotti, wrote a lot of articles in the New York Review of Books a few years ago. And he said, you see the problem. How can you say that the conscious properties you have in sensory imagery involve a relation to instantiated worldly property when you're just imagining? He takes the view that you're somehow in contact with the instantiations of that property that were there when you first acquired the concept. Slightly weird anyway. I think that for sensory imagery, just as for active sensory experience, the only coherent view is a fully qualitative one. It's all paint. How are you? 26 minutes left. Some of you might be wondering, look, I'm denying representationalism. I certainly don't deny that sensory experiences are representations. They represent the world to subjects, they guide subjects' actions in a way appropriate to the world outside. That's certainly true. My view is, while that's true, that's extraneous to the conscious nature of the sense experience. Conscious nature is one thing. As it happened, we use those conscious properties, those internal feeling properties, to represent the world outside. But you could have a being that had just the same conscious properties, but I don't know, brain in a vat, coagulating by accident in outer space, it would have those same conscious properties, wouldn't be representing anything. Here's an analogy. Take the words on the screen. They're representations, all right. They represent the world to be a certain way. How factual are they? Words can represent the world to be a certain way, they certainly represent, but they don't represent intrinsically. Just those words could have represented something different or nothing at all. So their words that are contingently, their representational properties are contingently attached to those typographical shapes. That's what I think about sensory experience. We have these internal feelings. It's contingently the case that they're correlated with certain features of the world. Because of that, we can use them to guide our actions in a way appropriate for those features. So in that sense, they're representations. But that doesn't contribute to their conscious nature. Okay. So that's the background. Now, what I want to talk about first is what do I say about transparency? What do I say about Harman's claim that look, which seems very plausible at first sight, try and introspect your experience. Well, I try and introspect my experience I'm having now, looking at you. Well, all that happens is I kind of look harder at Lucas and his glasses. I mean, I can't really look inside my head. That's what he says. So what do I say about that phenomenon? On my view, what's my answer to Harman's claim that the invitation to perform that exercise, trying to introspect your experience, just seems to make you stare harder at the world itself. Well, first thing to ask is what's supposed to be going on when we try and introspect our experience? We turn our mind in, we focus our attention on our experience. Well, I mean, there's a lot of muddle about this, but my own view is that the only sensible way of understanding what's going on is to suppose that in cognition we address the question, what kind of experience we're having. Now, I'm assuming here a distinction that philosophers make. Sometimes philosophers don't make. I'm not sure how much psychologists make the distinction. There's an issue about how to make the distinction, but there's a distinction between perception, sense experience, and cognition, thought, belief. I mean, here's the difference. I'm now experiencing you all, and I close my eyes, and I believe you're all there, and it's kind of got the same content. But in the first case, I've got sense experience. In the second case, I'm cognitively representing the same thing. So I think what Harman is inviting us to do is, in cognition, in the formation of beliefs, to form a belief about our experience. And at first pass, the phenomenon he's drawing our attention to is simply that when we do this, when we turn our attention to the nature of our experience, our cognitive attention to the nature of our experience, nothing changes in our experience. And that's not much of an argument against the qualitative view. I mean, after all, what would you expect to happen if you turn your cognitive focus onto your experience rather than the world? Do you think that's going to make your sensory systems all start working differently? I mean, that would be weird. I mean, the function of the sensory systems is to inform cognition. The sensory systems, give or take a bit, are pretty impervious to what's going on in cognition. You shouldn't be able to perceive things to be a certain way just because you expect them or want them or whatever. So, at first pass, what happens is we turn our attention to our sensory experience. Sensory experience all stays the same. That's all Harman is drawing our attention to. And I take that to be clearly as consistent with the view that our experience is constituted just by paint, just by internal positive properties, as by the view it's constituted by worldly properties. Both of them say experience is made of one kind of medium, and if that's so, you tend to experience
cognitively, nothing is going to change. It's still going on, being made one kind of meaning. There are views, I alluded to them earlier, on which there's two kinds of elements in experience. There's the qualitative feely bits that don't do any representing, and then the worldly properties that are doing the representing. And it's not clear that people like Bloch and Peacock and so on, who are keen on pointing to the existence of some qualia, don't admit that there's two kinds of elements in experience. And maybe on their view, it ought to be possible to somehow turn your cognitive focus from one kind of element to another. And maybe Harman has evidence that you can't. In fact, what Bloch and Peacock do is they dispute that evidence. They say you can turn your focus from. But anyway, that's not relevant to my view, because I think there's only one kind of element in experience, the feely kind, and that's all you can focus on. So, there are further issues here to do with maybe something in our experience does get changed when we attend to something. Sensory attention, it can change the nature of experience, it can highlight various contrasts and so on. We could go into that. That doesn't affect the basic point I'm making, which is that the transparency observation just says nothing changes when you turn your cognitive focus on your experience, and that's just what you'd expect, on my view. Here's a question. I say, right, so we can turn our cognitive focus onto our sensory experience and note what kind of sensory experience we're having. That was implicit in what I've just been saying. How exactly does that work? It's a surprisingly little discussed issue by philosophers. Philosophers talk a lot about self-knowledge, about our supposedly privileged, authoritative knowledge of our own mental states. And they worry about how exactly does that work? How exactly is it that we're so authoritative, if we are, about what's going on inside our heads? But for the most part, they worry about how do we know what we're believing, what we're thinking, and not so much how do we know what we're sensory experiencing. And it's a kind of funny question, because it seems so obvious that we know what we're sensory experiencing, but if there's two things that I'm supposing, there's the feely sensory experience, the rich technicolor, and then there's the belief that I'm having such a sensory experience, and they're two different things. What's the path from one to the other? Some people talk about it. Richard Fuhrman talks about acquaintance. Some people talk about acquaintance. Seems to me that's not yet an explanation. Stitch and Nichols have various boxology kind of explanations. Mostly they talk about their interest in beliefs more than Alex Byrne and Alvin Goldman have talked about this. And in fact, what I'm going to say now loosely draws on the kind of view they have. So I think the best account is that we get to know what experiences we have by noting what beliefs they incline us to form. So I'm thinking of what kind of experience I'm having. Well, my experience is telling me that Lucas is here in kind of Blackman's glasses, and so I conclude, I come to believe, indeed I know, that I'm experiencing Lucas, I'm experiencing that Lucas is sitting over there with Blackman's glasses. So that's my account of the mechanism, that we note that our experience inclines us to a certain belief, and then we form the belief that I'm now having an experience that, and now the content of the experience is just the content of the belief. I know I'm experiencing that P because I note, I'm aware that my experience inclines me to believe that P. Okay, there's lots to discuss here. How many? 50. 60. Okay, good. First problem, you might think that this little story I just told only pushes the problem back. So I say we know we're experiencing because we know what the experience inclines us to believe. But how do we know what we believe? Well, as I said, philosophers talk about self-knowledge a lot, and mostly I said they don't talk about experience, but they do talk a lot about how we get to know what we believe. And there's lots to say here, but one theory I rather like is one that's attributed to Gareth Evans, slightly confusingly, is called the transparency of belief. But Evans says, look, suppose somebody says to you, do you believe there's going to be a third world war? Do you, and you say, the person's asking you about your psychological state. So the natural way for you to arrive at an answer to that question is to ask yourself, is there going to be a third world war? And if you find yourself saying, yeah, I think there is, or no, I think there isn't, well that then itself tells you that you believe there isn't going to be a third world war. And so that's a rather nice, neat, attractive theory of how we know what beliefs we have. And I especially have to commit myself to that. That's the one that I find attractive for today's purposes. It just would be enough if there's some good account of how we know what beliefs we have. You might also ask about my suggested account of introspection of sensory experience. Even if we know what belief we're having, how do we know it's sensory experience that's inclined us to form that belief? I take it to be, how do we know that? It's kind of built into what are called perceptual beliefs. Beliefs formed on the basis of sense experience. I mean, if somebody said to me, how do you know that Lucas is sitting in the front row with glasses on? I mean, I would obviously know. I've got that belief on the basis of experience. I mean, people ask you to justify your belief. How do you know that? Well, I saw it. I mean, that's, so I'm inclined to help myself to the fact that we can tell when we have a belief on the basis of experience that we got it on the basis of experience. You might wonder, is that enough to know that you got it on the basis of sensory experience? There's certain contents that, I don't know, the ball is round that you might have got on the basis of vision, or you might have got on the basis of touch. I think you probably know when you form a belief on the basis of experience what sensory mode you got it from. So I could appeal to that. In fact, there's another resource here, Alex Byrne, who's running very much the line, but I do think you can read off what kind of sensory experience you have from the content of the belief. Exactly what you believe when you see a ball to be round is rather different from what you know when you feel it to be round. And so the fact you have information about the texture will tell you that you've got the belief from a tactile experience. Interesting question here is how much of this is going to apply to our knowledge of sensory imagery. And it's not so obvious that this story that looks to be pretty good for sensory experience. It's going to work so well for sensory imagery, because sensory imagery doesn't give you beliefs. I can imagine, suppose I'm rehearsing this talk to an interview, imagine Lucas is sitting there, sensorily, I can, doesn't give me the belief he's sitting there. Maybe, and this is an issue, that maybe it gives me a certain kind of sensory imagery, gives me the supposition that he's sitting there. I have the thought he's sitting there. I entertain the possibility he's sitting there on the basis of the sensory imagery. And so perhaps one could give an account of my introspective knowledge of sensory imagery on piggybacking on our introspective knowledge of what we're supposing. But then we need some story about how we know what we're supposing. The story that Gareth Evans told for how we know what we believe wouldn't apply in that case. So there's lots to discuss in connection with this proposed mechanism for sensory introspection. Here's a funny aspect of this. So I'm supposing that introspection uses concepts to refer to experience that identifies them in terms of what they're about, as to what they represent. Somebody phoning. Sorry, I had my phone on to help with the time. You might think, on my view, where sensory experience is supposed to be intrinsically just qualitative, not representational, how come I'm referring to experiences? How come it's natural to us introspectively to refer to experiences in terms of what they're about? I don't think that's a problem for me. I didn't deny that experiences were representational, and indeed that we're aware of representation. I just want to say they're not intrinsically representational. They don't have their representational contents built into their conscious nature. But certainly the experience I'm having now is the one that represents to me that Lucas is in the front row, and there's no reason why I shouldn't describe that experience as the experience which represents that Lucas is in the front row. Know what's going on here? It's a bit weird. I mean, it's not that weird, but so I'm now thinking of experiences in a way as involving two properties. There's the conscious property, the feeling property I'm having, and then the property of being in the state that represents Lucas to be in the front row. You might think these are two, I mean, if you think of states as instantiations of properties, you might think there's two different mental states here. The state of having these feelings, and the state of being in a sensory state that represents Lucas to be in the front row. I think these two properties correlate with me whenever one's instantiated, the other one is, but only contingently, so they're different contingently connected properties. I'm referring to the conscious feeling by its contingent correlation with the representational property. You might be thinking, but now it's talking about beliefs. Beliefs are mental states. Why don't they have these two aspects? That's kind of a bit weird. When we talk about beliefs, the belief that Lucas is there, we think of that state as essentially representing that Lucas is there. We think, take that state and suppose it doesn't represent Lucas is there, you think that's not a belief that Lucas is there. So we think of beliefs primarily as the instantiation of a representational property, whereas I want to say sensory experience, we've got instantiations of two kinds of properties going on. And why is that? I think it's because, while I think that there's something like the internal state, which is the vehicle of representation in terms of belief, I'm not convinced it has much of a phenomenology. Anyway, it doesn't have a particularly salient phenomenology. We're inclined to think of beliefs in terms of their representational properties. Whereas in the case of sense experience, it's pretty clear that we can think of them in terms of their conscious properties, as well as in terms of their representational properties. And once we do, I think we should think of those two things as different. Okay. Finally, phenomenal concepts. So, for many philosophers, phenomenal concepts are important. In fact, even for Tufan, who went away from phenomenal concepts to talk about the ability hypothesis, and it's very interesting to think about what kind of ability it is you have when you know what an experience is. He agreed that you can't answer the Mary problem just by being an ability hypothesis. You need to posit phenomenal concepts too. And these are concepts that we use to think about our sensory states in a special, direct way. And normally in the literature of phenomenal concepts, the literature that Tufan was talking about, these are thought of as kind of simple, direct. You've had the experience once, you imagine it later on, and thereby think about that kind of experience. Or maybe you're actually having the experience and kind of thereby think about it. The exercises of phenomenal concepts either involve imaginative recreations of the original experience, or maybe actual, current possession of the original experience, and thereby refer to the experience directly. I'm really keen on phenomenal concepts because I'm a physicalist and I want to use them to respond to the Mary argument in the way we were talking about earlier. I'm nearly done. How long have I got? 6 minutes. Good. I think I can be finished. So, you might wonder. Okay, let me just remind you, because this came up with Tufan's talk, but there's Mary. Before she's in the room, she has all the scientific knowledge. Later on, she comes out, and we think she knows something she didn't know before, but she knew about all the physical features of real experience. Therefore, there must be some feature of real experience that is not physical, and so physicalism is false, dualism is true. The phenomenal concept strategy for responding to that argument is to say, no, she hasn't become acquainted with some new feature of reality. There's, real experience is a certain activity, phi in B4, and she was always acquainted with that as a scientist, and now she has a new way of referring to it. This experience, you can imagine it, she's referring to the same thing in a new way. My friend Tim Crane says, 2 concepts, 1 thing, philosophers love that. So that's American. The morning star and the evening star is 1 planet. This experience, such and such activity in V4, referring to the same process. I don't want to disagree with Tufan. I mean, I said phenomenal concepts often introduced by imagination. The crucial feature of phenomenal concepts is not where they come from, or what you need to get them or something. It's just that they're a priori distinct from the old scientific concepts. So that you have the old scientific concept, activity in V4, you have this new concept, and you can't a priori know that they refer to the same thing. So there's a sense in which, at the level of concepts, you have some new thought. How's my new story consistent with this? And this is what I wanted to get to. Now I'm talking about introspection as picking out our experiences as of the form, this experience of a square, an experience of something red. And here we're referring to worldly properties. We're referring to the experience as experience that's about a certain worldly property, kind of properties that objects can have. And you might think, well, if that's the kind of concepts we use to think about experiences directly, why won't Mary have always had those concepts? Won't she have had the concepts of objects being red, of objects being square, when she was a scientist? I say no, actually. Not only does Mary acquire a new concept of kinds of experience, she also acquires a new concept of kinds of objects when she comes out of her room. You could run the Mary argument in order to show that red, considered as a property of surface property of objects, cannot be physical. I mean, which shows that the Mary argument proves too much. You could say, look, here's Mary, and she's always known about wavelengths and reflective profiles and reflectance profiles and so on. And now she should think of the colour of this, of Anna's jumper, as that colour. She might even yet know that that colour, if we do experience Mary, is the one she used to think of as reflectance profile theta. And if somebody was trying to run such an argument that surface properties were not physical, you'd want to say, no. Mary hasn't learnt about a new feature of surfaces, she's just learnt about a new way, she's acquired a new way of thinking about a certain feature of surfaces. So now I can think about it as that colour, and I recreate an imagination, or if Tufan is right, I at least can discriminate it, when before I couldn't. So, even if we think of phenomenal concepts as having the form, an experience of red, where red is supposed to be a property of worldly objects, that will still be a concept that's a priori distinct from all the concepts that Mary had before she came out of the room, and we can still run the response to the Jackson argument just as before. So even this more complex account of what's going on when we think introspectively about experiences is consistent with the standard phenomenal concept strategy to respond to Jackson. So you can adopt this account of what's going on in introspection, and everything proceeds as before. So I think the qualitative account offers the best account of the nature of sensory experience, and maybe a sensory imaginings too, including our ability to know about experiences through introspection. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, our commentator is Erhan Demircioğlu from Koç University, Department of Philosophy.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm a fan of Papineau's work, so it's a great pleasure for me to be here today commenting on his recent work. But luckily for the purposes of this conference, there are some things that I do not agree with. So the topic is the metaphysics of sensory experience. It's a very complicated topic, to say the least. And so it's very probable that there are some things that I do not understand or misunderstand, but we'll see. So I would like to make two comments, basically. One on what he calls the qualitative view, and the other on the mechanism that he identifies for the introspection of sensory experiences. Okay, starting with the first one, the qualitative view. Okay, so our sensory experiences are conscious, and they're conscious in virtue of instantiating certain properties, and let's call those properties conscious properties. So sensory experiences are conscious in virtue of instantiating conscious properties. Okay, so the question about the metaphysics of sensory experience is a question about the metaphysics of those conscious properties. And so far as I can see, there are three claims that are central to Papineau's all-paint view. One is conscious properties are intrinsic qualitative properties of sensory experiences. And by intrinsic, he means, well, whether the experience instantiates those properties or not, have nothing to do with what else is going on in the world. Okay, you can change the world in a way you want, but the experience could be the same. Well, because he's a physicalist, he said, well, given the same brain, well, the two brains are physically identical, and they will be having the very same experiences. And what else is going on in the world is simply irrelevant. That's the sense in which conscious properties are intrinsic. So that's one thing. The other thing is, well, conscious properties, the intrinsic properties of experience, are not worldly properties, such as yellowness, sphericity, and so on. So the intrinsic properties are not like that. Those properties like yellowness and sphericity, the sort of properties that you seem to be experiencing when you're taking a look at a yellow tennis ball, those properties are not actually the intrinsic properties of experience. Those properties can only be instantiated by worldly objects, but not by experiences, according to his view. So just as you cannot say that an experience is yellow, just as you cannot say that an experience is spherical, so there is no point in saying that those properties are properties of experience. Okay, that's the second thing. The third thing is the properties present in experience are intrinsic properties of the experience. Now, and that's what sums up it's all mental paint view. Now, one question that you can raise about this three different theses is that, okay, what are those properties? What are those conscious properties? So, in virtue of the instantiation of which experiences are conscious? Well, we know that, according to Papineau's account, they are not properties like yellowness and sphericity. But when we introspect, it seems to us as if we are finding those properties, yellowness, sphericity. And so it's not clear what those properties are if they are not those properties those introspection directly tells us about. So it seems that those conscious properties, given that they are not yellow, they are not yellowness, they are not sphericity, it seems that introspection must be mistaken, and always so, because what introspection tells us is that what I find now is this blueness. What I find now is this and that. And according to, it seems to me that on Papineau's account, introspection is always mistaken. That's the cost of rejecting transparency, it seems to me. So it's an extreme view, and I think Papineau is, yeah, I'm definitely aware of the fact that it's very counterintuitive. A Cartesian will say, well, introspection is never mistaken. It always gets things right. Okay, that's one view, that's an extreme view. And in response to that extreme view, many people say, well, okay, introspection maybe is sometimes mistaken. It's not, it's like perception. Perception is sometimes mistaken, so why not introspection? Okay, that's a kind of modernist view. But on Papineau's view, introspection is always mistaken, it seems to me. And that's another extreme view. So on the one hand there is Cartesian, on the other hand there is Papineau's view, and in the middle there is somewhere, okay. Sometimes mistaken, sometimes not. Okay, so that's a problem with me, it seems to me. So the other point I want to make is about this introspection, this mechanism for introspective knowledge. So Papineau identifies two different levels. First, okay, we know, so how do I know that, for instance, now I am presented with a yellow tennis ball? How do I know that I'm experiencing, I'm having an experience as of a yellow tennis ball right now, suppose that I'm having it. So how do I know that? First, well, I know that my experience inclines me to form various beliefs. And secondly, I know what those beliefs are I'm inclined to form, in virtue, I directly know them. Directly in the sense that by directly answering the question, how are things in the world? Whether things are thus and so in the world. Okay, those two steps. Okay, now, I have two questions about that. One is, okay, that very knowledge, my experience inclining me to form various beliefs. You talked about that, but that seems to be a sort of introspective knowledge. And you do not give an account of it, it seems to me. I mean, how do I know that my experience inclines me to form such and such beliefs? That seems to be a kind of introspective knowledge. So I know that I'm having an experience inclining me to form these beliefs. That's introspective knowledge. But without any kind of that, it seems that there's some, it doesn't seem to be complete. The other point is that, okay, it's not clear how to identify the belief that I'm inclined to form on the basis of experience. So having this experience, I'm inclined to form the belief that there is a yellow ball before me. But having the very same experience, I could be inclined to form there is something before me, or there is something yellow before me, or there is something yellow and spherical before me, or I may be inclined to form having the very same experience. This is the same thing as I saw before. Or, okay, my brother put this thing here, placed this thing here. So there are so many things that I may be inclined to form in virtue of having that experience, that it seems to me that trying to identify the experience that I'm having by reference to the beliefs that I'm inclined to form doesn't really give us introspective knowledge that we are really searching for. That's it.
I don't want to say too much. That was terrific. Yeah, very good experience. Let me say something very briefly about the two issues in reverse order. I mean, particularly the second one, there was a bit of my slide that I didn't talk about, which in fact was partly addressed that So you're worried that here I form the belief that I'm having an experience of a yellow ball, but I could equally have formed the belief I'm having an experience of a ball, or I could have formed the belief I'm having an experience of a big yellow. And you're worried about, I'm trying to identify the nature of experiences via this story. I'm not trying to give, in this introspection story, an account of the full, detailed, rich nature of the sensory experience itself. That's off to the side. I'm trying to give an account of how we form beliefs about those experiences. And indeed, there's scope to form a number of different beliefs. And I could think, truly, I'm having an experience of a ball, or a yellow ball, or a big yellow ball, and so on. Now, so that's not a worry for me. What's more of a worry is you said I didn't give an account. Well, I mean, I gave an account of how I know which beliefs I have, but I didn't give an account of how I know that I have those beliefs on the basis of experience, and I just helped myself to that from nowhere. And I agree that's a whole. About the more big thing that I'm accusing introspection of error. Look, the view I have is a very, very ugly view. That's why nobody likes it. It's horrible, and it's horrible in all kinds of respects. It's very contrary to ordinary thinking. I'm not sure I have to agree that introspection is always in error, but something pretty close to it. I think everyday thought, through and through, very deeply, equates the properties of experience. I mean, the idea that you get from transparency, that yellowness and so on is in our experience, that's built into everyday thinking. And in particular, let me just say to you once more, it can't be the yellowness of the ball that's in our experience, because I can know for sure that I'm having a yellow experience, even when I'm quite uncertain that I'm hallucinating or not. So what I know for sure is not that there's yellowness instantiated. Okay. Was implicit in the story, so I said after I said there's two ways of thinking, that you can think about the experience as a conscious state, you can think of it as a representational state. And you might ask, when I say to myself, when I form the belief that I'm having an experience of a yellow ball, am I forming the belief about the representational state or about a conscious state? And me, I'm a sophisticated fellow, I will disambiguate my thoughts if I need to. But of course, everyday people don't. They just think I'm having an experience of yellow ball, and they don't have stop to think, am I talking about the conscious feeling? Am I talking about the representational? And that's because everyday people think the two things go hand in hand, because they think the experience has the property of yellowness and roundness in it. So yeah, I think everyday thought is full of error.